I quit my corporate job. Yep, no other easy way to put it. And I want to talk about why, because there were a lot of reasons that went into that decision. And if I had to suffer for a couple of years, I may as well get some entertainment value out of it. Now, I know a fair amount of you all subscribe for my animatics, but a little fun fact about me is that well before that I used to do storytime videos, and considering I just hit the 10k subscriber mark, which I can't thank you all enough for, I thought it would be fun to return to my roots cause it's been quite a while since my last one. And then I thought to myself, what better story than my corporate job? After all, it did consume most of my life for the past couple of years, which you could probably tell if you're a long-time watcher, purely by how often I would apologize and be like, sorry for the delay, I was busy with work, tee hee ha ha, but I never really went into much depth on just how demanding it actually was. But before we begin, I should probably introduce myself because I don't think I've actually done that since well before a lot of you all subscribed. But yeah, my name's Percy for short, and for the past couple of years, I was working as what could be described as a corporate runt. You know that trope of overworked office employee you'll often see in media? Yeah, think something like that. But unlike a lot of those stories, I never had the fortune of getting a rich CEO to fall head over heels with me, nor did I encounter a world-shattering event where my commoner status ends up saving the day. That said, for the sake of privacy, I'm not gonna name any names and we'll keep things pretty vague, so keep that in mind. So before we get into the nitty gritty, I should probably give you some backstory which can hopefully give you some insight on my decisions in life. So in the nicest way possible, my family did not grow up in the most financially advantageous circumstances. Or to put it more bluntly, my family grew up on welfare and we lived in a so-called dodgy neighbourhood. But, and I cannot stress this enough, I was never bothered by it, nor was I ashamed of it growing up. I was still a happy child and I definitely felt loved, which is all what mattered. However, that said, it was definitely a driving factor as to why I was such a tryhard in school, where I put as much effort as I possibly could in academics, sports, and even artistic endeavors, so that one day I could get into a high-ranking university, which would hopefully someday lead me to a high-paying job, so me and my family could move to a nicer area and never have to worry about money again. And that's what I was on the road to doing. I made it into what was considered a highly reputable university, and even though the trek was well over 2 hours one way, so I'd be doing 4 to 5 hours of travel a day, I put up with it. But then, the global pandemic happened towards the end of my degree and subsequent graduation, which unfortunately meant that there was also a massive job shortage. So I was hit by a massive hammer of less jobs, more competition, not having 7 years of experience for an entry-level position, constant rejections for living too far away, and even some rejections for living in a quote-unquote dodgy neighborhood. And as time went by, the period between graduation and first corporate job widened, making it even harder to find something. But after a long period of time, I finally heard back from one of the corporate sales roles I applied for, who let me know I was proceeding to the next round, which comprised a psych test, a group assignment, and an individual component spread across a week, which, mind you, is pretty common for companies of this size. Well, at least from my experience. So the psych test went pretty well, I think. It was more so just a personality test for them to understand what types of environment I flourished in, but nothing too special. The following day though, I had the group assessment, but as luck would have it, one of my wisdom teeth started cutting through my gums, and it physically hurt to talk. But that was okay, I thought to myself, I've dealt with worse. So this group assessment was a generic case study where 6 of us were asked to answer a set number of questions and then present them to the reviewers at the end. And because there were 6 questions and 6 of us, we all decided to make one slide for the presentation. So I started setting up the slides while the others decided what questions they wanted, because to be honest, I didn't really mind any of them. And once they decided to lock in what they wanted, I was left one of the earlier slides, like the second one. I can't remember what the question was exactly, but I do remember what happened during the presenting stage, because when it was my turn to present my slide, because you know it was my question and my response, one of the other members of the team started yapping and stole my slide. She straight up acted like she wrote it, and because my mouth hurt because of the wisdom tooth cutting and the fact I didn't want to seem argumentative or confrontational, I just let her. But then when it came to her slide, she conveniently kept her mouth shut, which felt like a cue for me to answer. So I was stuck trying my best to respond to her question, which I hadn't fully prepared for, panicked in the back of my mind because her response didn't really make any sense. And then, once it was over, the judges didn't even give us input, so I had no idea what my performance was like from an outsider perspective. Then, after they were done, they gave us a little team debrief to just talk before the session was over without the judges. And the one who stole my slide was like, "Tee-hee, sorry I took your slide, it just looked more presentable." Like, what? How? How can you say that to someone after screwing them over? And then she dipped without a second to spare. And I think that was my first experience of corporate snaking, and I hadn't even started yet. So I left the assessment centre thinking there was no way I would get the job, because I was quiet and stuttering the whole time trying to explain someone else's half-done work. The following day I had the one-on-one meeting with one of the higher-up people, and much to my surprise, he was actually quite chill. Like, dude straight up wore shorts and a casual shirt and joked about me being way too overdressed. He ended up commenting on my performance from the group assessment, and to my complete and utter shock, the 3 judges who were watching the assessment had nothing but good things to say about me. They really liked how I took initiative to start setting up the slides and letting people choose things they're more comfortable with, and how quick I was at adapting to having to answer a different question, because apparently they were monitoring who was working on what so they knew my slide was taken, which was such a relief. Like, you do not understand. Outside of that, it was a pretty standard interview, and I don't think I did or said anything too spectacular. After a couple of weeks, or maybe even months, it kind of blurred to be honest, they sent the final results, and to my absolute shock, I made it. I actually managed to pull it off and got the corporate job I was desperate for after a long streak of misfortune. But much to my despair, the corporate life would soon be something that drained every fibre of my being. So, for vagueness sake, this sales job was around 2 hours away from where I lived, which, mind you, was fine for me for the most part. After all, I did way more travel in uni, and they also said post-training they would offer a lot of work from home, which ended up being true for most people except for my teams, but I digress. So I arrived extra early so I could guarantee I'd arrive on time for orientation, and mind you, I was ecstatic at this point, filled to the brim with joy and anticipation. A little nervous because this was the quote-unquote big league now, but definitely excited. There I met a bunch of new people for the week-long training, with most of them being incredibly kind, friendly and bubbly, except the snake who stole my slide, who for some reason managed to get in too, and to rub salt in the wound, didn't even recognise me. But that's besides the point. Everyone else was lovely, although I was definitely whiplashed by the sheer differences in our upbringings. Like, a number of them were children of CEOs, CFOs, or other big shot roles. Like, they weren't just upper class, their families were rich. And although they were all quite lovely and compassionate to begin with, it did feel like there was already a slight financial barrier set up quite early on. Anyway, the orientation week went rather smoothly, and after that was out of the way, they soon split us up and assigned us to our designated teams and projects, with the different projects having varying levels of length, size, and difficulty. They could range anywhere from a couple of weeks to many months to even a year. And knowing my luck, much to my demise, I was typically put on what I would describe as some of the more difficult long-term projects, and let me tell you, they were intense. And you would spend a lot of time with your team, which I'll get into in a bit. I already mentioned it before, but the office where I did most of our work was about 2 hours away, so that meant rather than a 9 to 5, I was effectively doing a baseline 7 to 7, and it was so unbelievably tiring. I thought I could handle it because I was doing more travel for uni, but the thing about uni is that you can leave once your classes are done, plus I wasn't going in 5 days a week. And unfortunately for me, my project managers highly encouraged my teams to go in every day, with highly encouraged being in quotation marks because if you didn't go, they would say some backhanded passive-aggressive comments, even though they lived less than half an hour away from the office, so it barely made a dent in their day. So I very rarely had the luxury of working from home, even though it was something they said they would offer. And unfortunately for me, that wasn't the only issue. In fact, the reality of this corporate job was that a 7 to 7 would be considered lucky for me. There was so much overtime. It wasn't uncommon for a standard week to approach 45 hours, and for busier periods it could range anywhere from 55 to 70 plus hours in a work week. That's not an exaggeration, by the way. It wasn't uncommon to have to work on weekends, and during the busiest of periods, I was working constantly to midnight, sometimes even creeping to 2 AM, with the absolute latest being 3 AM in the morning, which, mind you, I still had to arrive to the office at 9 AM the next morning. On the bright side though, they did reimburse any Uber fees and dinners during the busiest periods, but I would consider that the bare minimum when they're making you work incredibly late hours, especially when we weren't being paid overtime, which was my biggest gripe. We'd constantly be working excessive hours and we wouldn't get paid for it. All we had was a very weakly implemented time off in lieu, which capped incredibly quickly, so it was very common to have done what can be described as unappreciated work. In the end, it completely screwed over my sleep schedule, where I was always tired. Like, always. Weekends were purely there to catch up on sleep debt because I was out of it by the middle of the week, which made me feel even worse because it felt like I was wasting the little free time I had to begin with. And it wasn't just the excessive overtime that ruined my sleep schedule. Even when work wasn't super busy or egregious, I found myself staying up way later than I should have. I didn't actually know there was a term for it until pretty recently, but apparently it's called revenge bedtime procrastination, where an individual will sacrifice sleep for leisure time. Effectively, I was working so much all the time that I felt that if I just woke up, went to work, got home, ate and did chores, worked again, and then immediately went to sleep, my life would just be work. So instead of getting the 8 to 9 hours of sleep I should have been getting, I was cutting it down significantly just for me time. So I'd be playing video games or making videos for YouTube, which yeah, as a reminder, I was making YouTube videos as a side passion project thing in the background, so not only was I doing these excessive hours, I was also putting in a noticeable chunk of time whenever I had the chance in making videos. And if you've ever made an animatic or a storytime video before, you would know they take a long time to make, and most of them aren't monetizable because of copyright, so I don't even end up making much money from YouTube to begin with. So ultimately, I was either overly tired from the work itself or from my self-sabotaging habits in the fear that work would eclipse my entire life. And that's just on the sheer amount of work I was doing. On top of that, it wasn't uncommon to see or be subject to corporate snaking, where some of the more ambitious people would constantly bring other people down and overbrag about their individual performances in aims to get higher performance package results and early promotions. Like, I was someone who didn't want any of that to begin with, as those in high positions were even more overworked than I was, and there was significantly more responsibility. And even still, I was subject to some of them talking behind my back for things like eating at my desk during lunch, which, mind you, I only did so I could finish all my work, or leaving on time so I could catch my train because the transportation I used was pretty unpredictable, and even the slightest delay could considerably throw off my entire schedule. And also, to clarify, I was still working when I got home, I just wasn't doing it at the office. But even still, that was apparently a bad look. Could you imagine working till like 10 to 12 at night and still be clocked for not being a team player just because I wasn't physically sitting in the same room as them? Wild. And this kind of leads to my next point. Office politics and how your image was key. You see, office politics meant a great deal there, where there was what could be described as an in-crowd, which largely comprised higher-ranked employees, those that were generally richer, and those very eager to get an early promotion. In a way, it was very early 2000s high school movie click-coded, and much like those flicks, it left a lot of people feeling ostracized. Throughout my time there, I also noticed that this group also became increasingly snobbish, where they would flex about what often expensive activities they did on the weekend, and make you feel really bad if you didn't do anything they deemed as exciting. Which, to preface, there's nothing wrong with going out and enjoying life to the fullest and whatnot. It was more so their smug tone and the way they bragged about it to make you feel bad about not doing them. They would also make fun of people for not regularly eating out for lunch. Like, it was bad enough I was getting flack for working at my desk during lunch, but to then be ridiculed for bringing in bland lunches to save money too? Yeah, 'twas rough. Like, buying lunch every day ain't cheap, and I was already regularly copping high travel fares daily, which, mind you, they knew about. In the end, a number of them would just pick apart any small or petty thing they didn't like about you and use it as ammunition to attack your character, which was as baffling as it was pathetic. And to make matters worse is that some of the richer people would also be, I guess in the nicest way possible, less enthusiastic about working, where they would just leave in the middle of the day to go to the beach or something and not have a single worry about losing their job. Outside of office politics, I also faced some internal conflicts across different projects I was in, which is the polite way of saying I wasn't on good terms with some of my project managers. You see, it was pretty common for managers to have optimistic expected deadlines, where they would often want things done in a set time frame. However, sometimes these deadlines weren't reasonable, and they would expect you to do as much overtime as needed to get it done within their outlined schedule. And if you ended up deviating from the time frame, you would get the brunt of their passive aggression, and they would hold it over your head in any of the performance reviews or even idle gossip in the office. One specific project manager I had was one of the leading people in the in crowd, and very clearly did not like me on a personal level. I think there were some signs originally when the whole team wasn't able to keep up with his expectations, but it didn't really get that bad until the time I got really sick during one of our busier periods, where I was specifically told by a medical professional that I needed to quarantine for at least a week, and he did not take it well. Now, mind you, I was still working the necessary hours, including the overtime at home, and I was always online for the team to reach out if needed. I just wasn't physically present at the office. But after I came back, his passive aggression reached new heights, making snide remarks like, "Oh, I forgot you were here," frequently and intentionally excluding me from casual conversations, and would overall just kinda ignore me unless I specifically needed his help for something. But at the time, I kept telling myself, oh, it's just cause it's a stressful time and the pressure is getting to him. No point looking too deep into it. So after work started to calm down, we had a workplace function, and cause I didn't want the tension to continue, I tried to bridge the gap and talk to him casually 3 times. But every single time I tried talking to him, he had an immediate excuse, like he had to go to the bathroom, or he was going to greet some other people, or the third time where he just went and left mid-conversation. And at that point, I just knew our work relationship was broken beyond repair, which kinda sucked because we would still be working together on future projects too. The next project that we had together, I actually ended up finishing the work assigned to me early, and he wanted me to help the other team members with their components, which I wouldn't typically be opposed to if it weren't for the fact that he gave me way too much to do. Say 4 people on my team had 2 components each to repair. I finished my 2 early and was given 2 more components from my other team members, so I had to do 4 in total while the others did 1, 1 and 2 each. And because that was a lot of additional work, I was falling behind the schedule assigned by him. So then when it was nearing the deadline, i.e. the Friday before our weekend, he got annoyed with me, and I low-key think he gave me all this additional work and placed the brunt of it on me because the feedback session was coming up and he wanted an excuse to tank my review. In the end, I had to work all weekend until 10 PM both days to finish the additional projects, and his only response back was a dismissive, "Okay, but you didn't have to work on the weekend," and then he proceeded to not submit my feedback at all, as if he was hoping I didn't work the weekend and not finish the additional tasks so he could ruin my overall score, especially since I did a lot for that project, which isn't unfounded, okay? You may think I'm exaggerating or whatnot, but that's the exact type of behavior I witnessed over and over, like not just for myself but for others too. Anyway, another thing I hated was some of the additional travel we needed to do. Although most of our projects were done at the central office, occasionally we would need to directly travel to the offices of our customers. That way we could more readily get information and communicate with them to help meet their requests, and reduce the amount of revisions, which would ideally reduce the overall time we needed on a project. But they would also be in absolutely horrific locations. One time I was put on one that was 3 hours minimum away from where I lived. It was an absolute nightmare to get to, and the project managers were quite stubborn about going to that station instead of working from home or at a closer office, and I had absolutely no say in the matter. So during this period, I would need to do 6 to 7 hours traveling in a day to do 7.5 hours of standard work, and then do 3 to 4 hours of overtime when I got back. And I was on this project for well over a month, so I was absolutely destroyed by the end of it. Ultimately, my entire life became work. Some people say they experience Sunday scares, where they're scared to go back to work the following Monday, but I felt this every single night, every single morning. I dreaded work because it was consuming me. If I was talking with friends, 90% of the time it was me complaining about work, and I became so bitter and tired to the point that I didn't like who I was becoming. I even ended up slowly reducing how often I was hanging out or even messaging friends, because I was becoming disgusted at just how negative I was all the time, which obviously made me feel even more lonely. Like, you don't understand. Before I started this job, I was incredibly upbeat and optimistic, so to see myself become as broken as I was in a mirror was a horrifying experience. Now, you may be wondering why I didn't just leave earlier. Like, surely you could have just left whenever, right? But for starters, I wasn't exactly in the strongest financial position to quit early on, especially without another job lined up, and with how long the hours were, it also meant there wasn't much time in the day to actively look. Plus, the pay increase that came with promoting was substantial enough that it was like a sunk cost where I felt like if I left now it would be all for nothing. I just needed to put up with it for a couple more years. It also felt like they drilled it into you pretty early on that you were an insignificant cog in the machine, and that if you left it would be to your own detriment. Like, you wouldn't find anything better until you truly made a name for yourself. It was a really rough predicament, and as someone who didn't have much disposable income growing up and struggled to find my first corporate job to begin with, leaving was an incredibly scary thing to consider. But, as I mentioned at the start of the video, I did quit. And you may be wondering what the final straw was. Like, after years upon years of this horrifically draining experience, what could possibly be the event that gave me the courage to finally hand in my resignation letter? And to answer that question, bats. Yeah, you heard that correctly. This is gonna sound incredibly weird, but hear me out first. So one night I was walking home from work. It would have been like 9 or 10 PM or something like that, and I heard the most horrific, chill-inducing screeching sounds I had ever heard in my life. Sounds I had never heard before, coming from all directions. It straight up felt like I was in a horror movie, and that was the background music the audience would hear as I became the next victim to the slasher. It was truly terrifying. I couldn't pinpoint where or what the sounds were coming from, and then I looked up at the night sky and could see a dozen bats gliding in the sky with their dark bodies contrasting the bright glowing moon. But they weren't the only ones. From the faint streetlights I could see different colonies of bats flying around spontaneously. So I held my bag above my head in the off chance the bats would start swooping, cause I ain't a bat expert, and if you heard those sounds, you definitely wouldn't want to risk it. But then one of them began flying in my direction at knee level, and I had to dive to the side not to get hit. And let me tell you, bats are a lot bigger than they look. Like, I never really took into consideration how large their wingspan was until one came flying at me. Luckily, it didn't come back for seconds, and from what I could tell, most of them continued flying away as their vicious sounds lingered in the pitch black night. But the whole time I was scared out of my mind. My flight instincts cranked up to 110% because I'd never really experienced a bat encounter before. Like, sure, I've seen kangaroos, drop bears, snakes, spiders, magpies, dingoes, stray cats and dogs, even the wild-caught bogan. But most wildlife was pretty consistent, or at the very least predictable enough. With bats, I didn't have a clue. Would they come up behind me and shank me? Or jump me at the same time until there was nothing but bones? Who knows? Definitely not me. Cause what do you mean they were flying at knee level height on a footpath? And with the horror-inducing sounds, it just added to the terror. Like, wow, could this be it? Like, I didn't genuinely think the bats would take me out back and game over me, but the horror movie tone just really made me consider my entire life. Like, wow, if these bats really did get me, what would my life story be? And then, in the most grueling way possible, all I thought of was work. That's what my life would be in the end. And at that point, I knew I didn't want to do this anymore. So in the end, I stuck with the job for a couple more months so I could get the promotion I was due for, and finally handed in my notice. After all that burnout from overtime, excessive travel, toxic workplace culture, inner work conflict, and loss of self, I was finally confident enough to know that that corporate job wasn't for me. And as scary as it was also the most liberating experience of my life, as if all those burdens finally left me. With all that said, I guess I hope you all enjoyed listening to me rant. It's been quite therapeutic putting all my grievances into words, and it's been equally fun doing another storytime video after having not done one in so long. And hopefully if you're in a similar situation, you could resonate with at least some of my struggles. Anyway, I know it can come across as desperate and whatnot, but if you did perhaps like this video, I actually highly encourage you to check out my other storytime videos. They're all still up on my channel and there is a playlist, and watching, liking, commenting and sharing those two is probably the best way to support my channel, as unfortunately, as much as I love doing animatic videos, most of them aren't monetizable. I know it's a pretty big ask, but it would mean the world to me if you could consider it. On that note, if you haven't already done so, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications, and let me know down below if you've ever been in a soul-sucking parasitic job before. Who knows, maybe we can bond over it. With all that said, stay safe and stay lovely. Bye bye!